The first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of every person, written by Sarah Lammert. I first encountered Unitarian Universalism in college through some friends who were active in the peace movement. A couple of times, I went to candlelight vigils on the grounds of the local UU church, but I didn't attend any actual Sunday service until I went home with a friend for a weekend in Maine during my senior year. The main thing I remember about the first visit is how moved I was by the sermon offered by Reverend Peter Richardson. He was just returning from a leave of absence after the death of his wife. And he spoke in an incredibly personal way about the long grieving process he had endured. I awakened that morning as if I had never before actually participated in my own spiritual journey. Perhaps because the minister laid himself bare, I too was laid bare. I felt seen and heard and eager to experience more. I felt I had come home. I had grown up in a church that believed that individuals were fallen beings, weekly repeating a liturgy that confessed my unworthiness to even pick up the crumbs of the foot at the foot of God's table. I had lost my sense of being at home in the denomination of my childhood. Even though I loved my first visit to the UU church, it took me 3 more years before I was ready to root myself in a religious community again. On my second foray into the UU church, this time in Brooklyn, I sat in my pew and read the open and bracing words that the congregation's covenant, which invited my whole person to the table. Here, there would be no discussion of unworthiness. Instead, our inherent worthiness as human beings was emphasized. I had recently been through a difficult breakup with my college boyfriend, and I was feeling lost and very alone. That Sunday morning, I found myself literally crying with relief to find a community of faith I could belong to, a place where I could bring my doubts, my questions, and my confusion, and still be accepted. I heard clearly the church's unspoken message: come as you are and be welcome. Here you can be yourself. Here you can continue the journey.
Humans are fundamentally social creatures. We rely on one another not only for our physical survival, but for love, courage, happiness, and hope in the face of tragedy. Yet, fear keeps us apart in our wider society. We fear differences based on religion, class, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, culture, or gender identity. Still, something deep inside us is pulled towards a different vision of human community, one in which the worth and dignity of every person is honored, and the fundamental interdependence of human life is understood. This twofold promise first drew me to Unitarian Universalism 20 years ago, and it continues to attract visitors to our doors today. Recently, I visited Ellis Island, which stood as the portal for over 12 million immigrants coming to the United States. Picture a stone and brick castle with 4 turrets and stunning wrought iron details standing in the shadow of the Statue of Liberty on the island in New York Harbor. Just imagine the steamships, ferries, and barges crowding the harbor and the anxiety of the steerage class passengers arriving in the Great Hall of Ellis Island. They are speaking hundreds of languages and carrying what little possessions they can into an unknown land and life. They are told Put your things down here and walk upstairs. After a quick legal quiz, the immigration process is over for most passengers. Off they go to buy tickets for the ferries and trains that will carry them into an unknown land and life. As I stared these many years later at the photographs of the immigrants, I couldn't help but think that their quest wasn't so different from that of the religious seekers who arrive at our Unitarian Universalist congregations on Sunday mornings, seeking that elusive portal to a new life and a new land. The people who arrive at our metaphorical shores don't necessarily speak our language, and they too are anxious about stepping forward into the unknown for the promise of greater freedom on the one hand and belonging on the other. Our visitors also carry baggage, not their literal possessions, but the accumulation of a lifetime of emotional and spiritual clutter. Welcome. Put down your burdens and walk on in, we say. The only difference is that in UU congregations, there will be no tests, creedal or otherwise, that prevent one from entering. All are indeed welcome here. The other side of this analogy is that all too often, UUism, like Ellis Island, acts as a mere gateway rather than a destination. We affirm people in their uniqueness, and for many who have felt rejected because of some aspect of their identity or their doubts, this is a healing message. But if we are to be more than a spiritual way station for the dogmatically wounded, we are going to have to dig a little deeper into the meaning of our first principle.
Historically, the affirmation of the inherent worth and dignity of every person was first articulated in the American Unitarian context as a direct attack on the Calvinist orthodoxy of the 19th century, William Ellery Channing. And other Unitarian ministers of his day protested the idea that human beings are fundamentally depraved. Instead, Channing presented a vision of the perfectibility of the human mind and spirit. He suggested that a spark of divinity resides within each of us. Similarly, our universalist forebears emphasized the goodness of creation and the promise of salvation for all through the grace of a loving and beneficent God. What began as a theological position has evolved over the past century of UU into a more humanist understanding of inherent worth and dignity as an ethical basis for living. Rather than referring to the divine within connecting each person to a larger whole, our first principle has become something of a celebration of individualism. On the positive side, this means we strive to affirm and respect differences, fueling our commitment to a faith that rejects oppression of all kinds. But on the negative side, we have made something of an idol of the individual. We mistake the affirmation of individual worth and dignity for a kind of defensive arrogance about our particular point of view. This can translate into a rather tepid commitment in time, money, and passion for our congregations, and the UUA as well as a distrust of authority and undercuts our leadership. Our fierce individualism informs our religious language and practice as well. During my early years in the ministry, like many of my colleagues, I attempted to be inclusive and respectful by using the laundry list of liturgical style. Dear God, Goddess, Creator, Spirit of life and love, mystery behind the veil, O higher power, creative energy spark of insight, light of truth and reason, and source of all being. But somewhere between spirit of life and higher power, the eyes of my congregants did beginneth to glaze over.
So I gave up such lengthy meditations altogether in favor of poetry and silence. Poetry can mean anything to anyone, and silence is an equalizer, bringing a sense of reverence and mutuality to the congregation without preference for theological positions. But I further discovered that, while powerful, poetry and silence have their limits. I long to hear about God, said one woman in my office, wondering where she could find a long-term home in our congregation. She hung in there for a while, but eventually left. I am concerned that you are pushing us in too spiritual a direction, said an earnest man in my office, wondering whether the humanist in the congregation could continue to feel at home. He is still officially a member, but I see less and less of him. It is a delicate dance, this foxtrot between individual belief and corporate worship, and one that is evolving in our movement. Not surprisingly, congregations tend to take on individual theological identities. This one is known to be more humanist or pagan. This one is more Christian. The trick then is to define what holds us together across these congregational particularities, which brings us back to the 7 principles commonly affirmed among us. During his tenure at the annual UUA General Assembly in 1998, sociologist Robert Ambella challenged us to reverse the order of our 7 principles, starting with our affirmation of the interdependent web of all existence, of which we are a part, as our first principle, and relegating the inherent worth and dignity of every person to number 7. We are born helpless and dependent, and only through the love of others will we ever become autonomous selves. If we are fundamentally relational creatures, as I think both biology and sociology affirm, then ontological different individualism, religious or secular, is simply a mistake, but one with enormous cultural consequences, with which Americans in particular will have to deal.
We need to embrace an expanded view of the self, in which the first and 7th principles are inextricably linked. Like the ancient Ouroboros, the snake or dragon that devours its own tail, symbolizing a constant process of creation. The self does not exist outside of the community, but is a function of our network of relationships. I have my own body with its protective layer of skin and its interior structures that sustain my life. And of course, we are each unique with individual thoughts and talents. So although I have inherent worth and dignity as a person, it is also true that my identity is part of something larger than myself. Like Channing, I believe that our first principle has theological connotations, that which I call God. For me, God is not otherworldly, a personal ruler seated in a heavenly throne, but it is an immanent present infused in all of life. And this present cries out that we each must use the gifts we are given in the service of the whole. Our world is in grave peril, and we are called to respond. Though we may feel we are inadequate to the task, in the words of June Jordan, we are the ones we've been waiting for. Indeed, there is no other to save us.
Whether we invest our money in worthy causes or offer our time and talent in the service of the common good. This is the liberating message of our first principle, that at the heart of life, our very lives, abides a transforming and sustaining love. It is inherent in us. It is in me, and it is in you. This love demands to be made manifest here on earth, and it links us together in an inextricable network of beauty, of pain, of hope. As a young adult, I sought a place of acceptance and belonging when I walked through the doors of a Unitarian Universalist church. Now, as a minister, I hold up for others the vision of that dual affirmation that once brought me to this faith. Each Sunday, I remind our friends and members that each is precious and worthy, that each belongs to this world like a wave that rises out of the sea. Each is a gift to offer this aching world. Come as you are and be welcome. Here you can be yourself. Here you can continue the journey.